Good afternoon, and welcome to the first day of IMF World Bank Week at the Atlantic Council. I'm here at the IMF headquarters at our pop-up studios. My name is Ananya Kumar. I'm the Deputy Director of Future of Money at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center. Today I'm going to be having a conversation on bridging trust, inclusion, and safety in digital public infrastructure. I'm joined by a fantastic panel. To my right, I have Justin Sherman, CEO of Global Cyber Strategies and a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. I have Katherine Hadda, who is a visiting fellow at CSIS, and I have Kay McGowan, who is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at Digital Impact Alliance. Thank you all for joining me, and let's jump in. Our conversation is going to be anchored by 3 new reports that we have out this week, all 3 on digital public infrastructure. You've all been involved in some parts of this paper. I really thank you for your work, and I'm really excited to dive into its findings. Kathy, my first question is to you. You wrote a paper. The paper's title is How DPI Can Support Financial Inclusion. And your paper cites India's UPI, Unified Payments Interface, as a significant advancement in payments infrastructure. Could you discuss why that is? Can you discuss some of the particular features, whether policy or governance-wise, that have allowed it to be a success in financial inclusion?
Sure. Well, let me thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Let me just clarify, I did not write this paper alone.
That's true.
I had a co-author, and we drew on the considerable expertise of a number of people who were experts in their field. They came from industry, from government, from civil society, and the reason I bring all this up is because, given the short length of the paper, we decided to focus on India because of its striking success of using digital public infrastructure to promote financial inclusion, but also to try and see if there were principles we could parse out that might be useful elsewhere. So what India really did was create an iterative model of inclusion, which draws on digital privacy and empowerment, and also public investment in infrastructure and know your customer principles. There's a whole raft of policies. And time-wise, it was also very iterative. It drew on something called the Aadhaar system, biometric identification system, that was introduced in 2009. Then in 2014, there was a program called PMJDY that was designed to draw underserved populations into the financial system. And then the Unified Payment system that you highlighted was introduced in 2016. And by any measure, it's been remarkably successful. It is about 80% of Indian adults now have bank accounts, up from 35% in 2011. And then also, during COVID, for example, despite the lockdowns, government subsidies could be deposited right into people's accounts, and the same system was used to also promote vaccinations, so they were able to vaccinate 1 billion people in just a few months. So, and also, India is now the largest source of has the most number of instant digital payment transactions in the world. So it's a big success.
Yeah, and all 3 of the papers have focused on emerging markets primarily. India's a big one that is a focus of all 3 papers, but also Brazil and Estonia or some other papers that the papers talked about. A common thread that I noticed across these 3 papers was the issue of digital trust and how it could be a marker of success or not. Justin, the issue of digital trust is central to your paper, and I want to see why that is, and how do you see it played out in DPI models across the world?
Yeah, sure, and likewise, credit the great working group members for their contributions. All opinion failures are my own. So, but digital trust, right? Really, how do you trust digital systems? As we're saying, is so integral to these things like getting citizens to sign up for services, getting people to want to give their data over to a payment system, to an identification regime, and so. What we really tried to do in our study was think about that along 2 axes. So the first being technical ways of ensuring digital trust, right? We can think about encryption, we can think about are you allowing people to audit the technology that you're putting out, right? Or is the government saying, trust us, it's safe, it's secure, no one needs to look, right? So thinking about those digitally focused mechanisms. But I think what we emphasized more in the study is that it actually needs to go far beyond that. And it's often tempting to kind of focus on the code or the encryption and sort of lose the bigger trust picture, which has to bring in social factors, political factors, rule of law. And so we really talked about everything from if you're a citizen, and you're having your government say, trust us, we have safeguards in place around security or privacy. Do you trust the government's checks and balances? Do you trust the rule of law? Like, those are important questions for then trusting the digital system. And the same thing for companies. If you're an investor, you go into a country or a company going to support a DPI project, you're going to want to know that if something goes wrong, is there a robust civil society community that will call it out and so forth. So I'll just wrap by saying, I thought it was interesting, certainly we looked at India as well, to see kind of a range of those factors in different countries, right? So India, I think, as mentioned with payments, did remarkably well on the trust front. They rolled it out slowly. At the same time, you have concerns about privacy issues with government surveillance, and we can copy that to Ukraine and other places where positives in some areas and in other places there are places for trust to be strengthened.
And specifically in the case of India, we're talking about data breaches that have happened in the past, and what you're talking about is setting up a governance mechanism that includes redressal mechanisms for when harms actually happen to consumers.
Right.
Kay, I know you do a lot of work on digital public infrastructure in emerging markets, and digital trust, like Justin said, is really at the core of what makes DPI successful or not. And we've lived through what is now a decade of implementing digital public infrastructure projects around the world, some of which you've been involved in. Where do you see the biggest trust gaps are right now, and how do you think we can address them?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much to the Atlantic Council and for having me to be part of this conversation, and congratulations on the 3 terrific papers. So yeah, I think the role that digital public infrastructure has played in radically accelerating financial inclusion in the last 10, 15 years is remarkable. But of course, with this growth, you're now moving into market segments where people may have less experience with financial products. They may be less digitally literate. They may be less able to understand when something goes wrong, how do you get redressal? And I know you've talked a lot about Aadhaar and the UPI system in India, but I think it's also interesting to look at another market that's really just blown up in the last couple of years, which is Brazil's instant payment system. And that has grown so quickly and reached so far down market now that they're almost a little bit of a victim of their own success, and that they haven't thought as much about exactly what you just said, which is meaningful redressal mechanisms. Yeah. And so one of the things that we are doing now at the Digital Impact Alliance, working with a range of stakeholders around the world, is thinking about online redressal, online dispute resolution systems, which frankly really need to be part and parcel of these core foundational systems that are building out. So if I could call for more attention and more investment in building trust, it would be letting people have easy, meaningful access to redressal systems and giving them more transparency and control over how their data is being used, right? That's one of the coolest things that's been happening in India, which is you have this ability to very granularly control your consent and revoke your consent, and then you see it digitally logged. And so I think, the field is moving quickly in how to address these trust gap.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, and you've identified a core issue here, which is that even as we digitize the actual services, the adjacent services of redressal mechanisms or ID services, which actually help people enable them to get on to any form of DPI, themselves are still analog. So the question is, how do we digitize everything, and which part of the stack, Kathy, to your point, do we pick? Justin, one of the recommendations your paper talks about is about creating global standards, particularly around cybersecurity, privacy, trust, the things that we're talking about. Now, this is something that we've talked about in several papers, right? It's kind of a throwaway line to say we need global standards, everyone needs to agree and adhere to those standards. What should the audience of the paper, largely public and private sector and civil society need to keep in mind in order to actually achieve this goal? And what organizations do you think are going to be pivotal to achieving those goals?
Yeah, it's an important question. I think, first and foremost, thinking about privacy and cybersecurity not just as integral to the social outcomes of DPI, right? If we're building an identity system, as we're saying, to increase access to banking or reduce fraud or whatever it is, let's not have that become a surveillance system, right? Is probably a good part of the picture, but it also is essential to the system's functionality. We've all seen, you mentioned data breaches, right? Too many times where either something is designed in a really centralized or insecure way, it goes down, it's very difficult to get back up, it's very disruptive, or the plane doesn't even get off the ground, so to speak, because there's a big scandal from the outset and things weren't in place to have those safeguards. So what to do? I think the first thing is recognizing that, at least in my opinion, we have a much richer set of cybersecurity standards globally than we do for data privacy. Singapore, Japan, UN, OECD, the list goes on these different areas, but the really unique thing about DPI that our group talked a lot about was the intersection, right, of public and private data collection and surveillance, like we're all saying. That's not, it's often treated separately, right, by existing frameworks. So I'd say the biggest things are, I would think for groups like the OECD, the UN, regional organizations to do that work of looking at that intersection. And then the second piece is not treating this as static. This is the other problem, right? We checklist away these issues. Security is not a state, right? It's a process, same thing with privacy. So I think the more that organizations can build that into DPI, the more sustainable those efforts are going to be.
Right, I think that's a really good point, and another organization I'll bring up is the G20. That's actually done quite a bit of work on payments improvements and how to have like the key performance indicators to actually measure where you are in your process of payments improvements. Kathy, I'm going to talk about what you address in your paper, which is that there are certain obstacles to achieving financial inclusion. How do you think countries encounter those, and how do you see countries overcoming those obstacles over time?
That's a very good question, particularly as India is now promoting its technology to other countries. I mean, I think we have to recognize there are certain characteristics that are perhaps unique to India that not every country has. A vibrant IT, software sector, for example, very low cost, very low cost telecommunications. I think it's part of the cheapest in the world. But even more than that, I think it's important to build on what Justin said about the sustainability. You know, you want private sector involvement, because that's where your innovation is going to come from. And there are countries also where they don't trust government with all their data. So it's very important first to do a digital readiness survey and really build your policies off that, just both policy-wise and technology-wise. What are you ready to absorb? And then the second thing is to take a holistic approach. I mean, even with all the digital aspects that we're talking about here, just because someone has an account doesn't mean you're really accessing the financial system. So you really have to include that in a whole suite of policies designed to empower people and get them into the financial system. And then lastly, and very crucially, you really need to get the public-private incentives right, the balance. You need the oversight, but also the leeway. Not every country can make a tiny bit of profit off 1 billion people, and you have to design incentives, market-based incentives, and that's how you'll make it sustainable, building on what Justin is saying.
Right, and this is something we hear very often, which is that the public sector by itself is not going to be able to provide the goods to everyone they need to. Public sectors in many countries are not large enough, and they have fiscal issues that they're dealing with internally. I think that's a really good point. And then, I just want to highlight your point about financial access as well. If you're thinking about access to a bank account as a metric of how financially healthy you are, it's just the beginning of your access into a broader financial system. Kay, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what you see challenges about implementation of DPI globally, and then I'm going to bring it back to the US because you've worked for the US government. What do you think the US government can do? Where do you see their role is in this?
Yeah, two great questions. So I think the biggest challenge is that there's no one natural home in a government for DPI, right? Because these are cross-cutting horizontal systems that we're thinking about, or if we're actually thinking about DPI as an approach, a design and governance approach rather than the foundational layers, you don't have this kind of framework set up yet in governments that really promotes coordination, cooperation, collaboration that's required. And so what we're seeing around the world is that is the biggest sticking point, is how to get started and how to get the right people, both from kind of the interagency within a government, but also the key stakeholders from outside of government, whether it's the private sector,
Totally agree.
civil society, academia, to think about how you shape these rules and how you prioritize, because all of these, both technical design choices, but also governance design choices, involve trade-offs, right? And so they have to be contextualized to priorities and the socioeconomic reality. And so I think finding that way to convene is really important. And we've found increasingly that peer learning is one of the better ways to think about that, because then you have decision makers who don't necessarily feel like they're being sold something, right? Whether it's from the government of India or Oracle or whomever, but rather they get to focus on what the challenge is and understand from peers in other countries' experiences of what's worked and what's not worked. So we run a large peer learning network in Africa with Smart Africa and the UN Economic Commission for Africa that focuses exactly on these questions.
Well, that's true. Yeah. I want to echo your point about not having a home within the US government for DPI in general. It's a question I get very often from our foreign counterparts, which is that who do I go to if I have a question about digital ID in the US?
Right.
Who do I go to if I have a question about AML CFT? Because there's 3 agencies handling various parts of it. It's a challenge in working with a large government like the US. Justin and Kathy, last question to both of you, and Kathy, I'll start with you. I want to give you the opportunity to distill what you thought was the most important learning of your paper for our audience, and what are you hoping that they get after they read it?
I hope they get the message that it is important to have the kinds of partnerships that Kay is talking about, as well as the kind of trust that Justin was talking about. What you really need to be is user-focused, and you have to always think about, especially if you're talking about issues of financial inclusion, how is it that you'll reach people? How will you get them to trust in the system? How will you educate them about the possibilities that the system offers to them? And how do you make a system that's sustainable over time to include both public and private participation? And I think Kay is right that building an entire ecosystem involving, commercial, government, civil society is crucial to getting all that.
Thank you. Justin, same question.
I'd echo that and repeat the point. I really do think it's just important, right? These things are processes, as Kathy's saying, right? This is not a check the box, do it once. To have it be sustainable, to have it deliver results, you need continuous trust assessments, privacy impact assessments, cybersecurity evaluations of different systems. And so that has to be an ongoing effort. That can't be a one-off. And the second thing is, we mentioned market incentives. There are places, I'll go on about bad, corporate privacy practices all day, but there are places, right, where with DPI, companies involved in them do have incentives to promote these practices. Cybersecurity is a great example, right? If company A is trying to sell their DPI contracting in 2 countries, you don't want to be too cozy with one of them, right? The other one's not going to trust you. So there are actually, I think, real incentives already for some of these outcomes in the private sector. So where else can we dial those up to really get those outcomes?
Thank you, and I want to thank all of you again for joining us today, and thank you for your fantastic work on the 2 papers. I want to thank all the working group members for their work on these papers as well. As I wrap up this panel, please note that this is one of our many events this week, so you'll be seeing a lot of us this week at this IMF studio, and thank you. That's it.
Thanks.
Thank you.